Couple of decades back, on September 11th, 2001, a day you may remember, just after two planes had slammed into the World Trade Center and minutes after a third plane had hit the Pentagon, a lady called Jo Moore, one of those Blair babes, as people still said back then and were permitted to say back then, Jo Moore sent an email to her boss. It is now a very good day to get out anything we want to bury. Councillors' expenses? That's a reference to some piffling little U-turn, embarrassing to Tony Blair's ministry, but Ms Moore saw 9/11 as a grand opportunity to get out embarrassing news the government wanted to bury, even as thousands of people were being literally buried, or indeed entirely vaporised. It's important to remember that this is how government-type people think. The appointment of a new Prime Minister is not formally a catastrophe on the scale of 9/11, although it may feel like that after the last 2, 3, whatever PMs. But it is an excellent time to, as Jo Moore says, get out anything we want to bury. So weirdly enough, for the last 2 days, the House of Commons has looked like the running order of the Mark Steyn show. Yesterday they had a debate on Telford and the scourge of grooming gangs serially raping English girls. Today they had a debate on victims of the COVID vaccines. Golly, it's such a shame these debates took place at a time when every political correspondent is standing outside the gates of Balmoral. What unfortunate timing. Fortunately, all our legislators were there. Here's the Commons, packed with members outraged by the ongoing child sex slavery of English girls. Look at that. I count... Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 Tories in attendance. Let's go over to the opposition benches. I think I see 3 members of the opposition parties there, so that's basically 1 member for every 2 opposition parties.
The scale of the abuse suffered by young, vulnerable women in her constituency over a number of decades is truly...
If it had fallen below 1.3%, you might have got the impression that the rape of children year in, year out in Telford, as in Hull, as in Oldham, as in Rotherham, as in your town here, doesn't matter a jot or tittle to our elected representatives. Were those 9 persons at least honest about who's doing all the gang raping? Did they utter the word Pakistani? Oh, no. Okay, how about, let's see now, Asian. Well, the closest anyone came to identifying the perps was this chap, explaining why no one identifies the perps.
The scale of the abuse suffered by young, vulnerable women in her constituency over a number of decades is truly absolutely shocking and repugnant, as are the failings by the authorities, which she has alluded to, going back years and years. Telford, Rotherham, Rochdale, Huddersfield, Halifax, and in countless other places, young, vulnerable women failed by the authorities because they were too politically correct to call out what was going on.
Scott Benton. OK, the authorities were, quote, too politically correct. Now, I don't want to give the impression Telford is a depraved hellhole, because I'll get another Ofcom complaint. So in the interest of due impartiality, here's a recent promotional video made by Telford Council. You'll enjoy this.
When I moved to Telford, they gave me a great place to work and some very impressive neighbours. There are stunningly modern offices here, even an enterprise zone.
The M6 is just 20 minutes down this motorway, and Birmingham is only 30 miles away.
But there's so much to do here, my family is always out. I know, they like to go for walks around here. Perhaps they're shopping. Wrong again. No. I know.
I've been looking for you all over Telford.
Nice, isn't it?
Move your business to Telford, the growing state.
The growing state, Telford, the growing state of denial. Like that dad, you'll be looking for your daughter all over town. There's so much to do here, particularly if what you like doing is 9-year-old girls. Samantha Smith is a victim of Telford. That's to say she's a victim both of its rapists and its culture of denial. Samantha, what do you think of that promotional video? Did that Telford ever exist?
Well, it's quite amusing that
that commercial seems to be from the 1980s, which is where the leader of Telford Region Council, Councillor Sean Davis, seems to want us to focus on. He said that CSE in Telford was 30 years ago, that he was only 3 years old at the time, so therefore, obviously, he had nothing to do with it. It isn't like he's been the leader of the council since 2011. So I'd say that commercial could probably be played nowadays by the leader of Telford and Wrekin Council, according to the decade that he seems to be stuck in.
There's so much to do here. This, I mean, it's fantastically tone deaf retrospectively. But the Telford report that came out a few weeks ago does actually single out the Member of Parliament for being uncooperative. Yes, and 2 police officers who both have the same name, Detective Chief Inspector Jeff Harding and Detective Chief Inspector Clive Harding. He was responsible for investigating the murders of Lucy Lowe and her sister and her mother. Basically, what I find interesting, though, is the point that Maggie Oliver made on this show last week, that the main people who are absent from all these reports are people like you, people who are victims. They're actively discouraged from actually giving any testimony to these investigators.
I'd say that the focus of reports like the Crowther report, the Telford CSE report, it should be on victims, survivors, and how to prevent more children from falling prey to Pakistani grooming gangs. I think that the Telford report is really a testament to the bravery of those survivors that put their heads above the parapet despite decades of denial, victim blaming and ignorance from those in positions of power. You know, when I reported my abuse, I remember being asked by a social worker, if you were physically abused, why were there no bruises? And branded a troublemaker and one of those girls because I had somehow invited the abuse that I had suffered, and that story is echoed by thousands of girls in areas like Telford.
And just to be clear, in your case, the abuse began when you were 5 or 6 years old, something like that. So as a 5-year-old girl, it's somehow your fault if you have sexual predators doing what they did to you.
In Telford, social services, councils, police officers, they found it far easier to blame the little girls that had been brutally raped, abused and exploited than to actually prosecute those responsible. It's far easier to say that the child was asking for it, that, you know, the flowery dress or the children's pyjamas that they were wearing were too provocative, and that they were child prostitutes or white slags, or you know, that they had a relationship with a Pakistani man that was entirely consensual despite the fact they were 12 years old. It's far easier to do that than to address the core of the problem, which is that councils, those in positions of power, were too politically correct, as Scott Benton said. They were too scared of being branded racist to actually address the state of grooming gangs.
Well, wait a minute. Did Scott Benton actually say that? Because Scott Benton, in the same way as Rishi Sunak, says, "Oh well, it's all this political correctness," and yet at the same time, neither Rishi Sunak nor Mr. Benton actually identified the perpetrators. So even when people are being courageous, saying, "Oh, I'm not politically correct," in fact they are. They won't talk about it honestly either.
I think that the culture of silence and ignorance and incompetence has pervaded all corridors of power for decades now. That's why Telford and Wrekin Council was so easily able to block calls for an inquiry for years. It was Lucy Allen, and I would say Lucy Allen and Mark Pritchard could not be further apart in their response to the CSE scandal. Lucy is the one that secured the adjournment debate into the Telford CSE scandal, and despite the poor attendance, which is often the case with adjournment debates, unfortunately, I wish it had been given more government time, and I hope that Liz Truss will stick to her promise and make sure that grooming gangs are given time on the agenda and are effectively tackled. But I think that those in the corridors of power find it all too easy to brush victims aside because they aren't, quote-unquote, newsworthy. Predominantly white working-class girls aren't seen as worthy of support, justice, or being believed.
No, that's true. They, for some reason, the media, the culture in this country, the broad culture seems to have decided that girls like Samantha are not worthy of being accorded victim status. It's great to have you with us, Samantha.